Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
Look who's back again. It's Ollie Horn. Tell your friend.
And joining us this week is disability activist and historian Mark Bookman. When it comes to accessibility planning, the Japanese River Cruise Kyokai always consults him first, before just doing the cheaper thing that they had already decided to do. Mark, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
On this week's show, Mark has the inside scoop on the Japanese government's efforts to improve and highlight accessibility ahead of the Paralympics. And if you don't mind us bragging about our own activism, we might tell the story of how Ali and I got the Japanese government to cover up a bunch of cracks on the sidewalk by telling them that the cracks were coronavirus infection numbers. Plus, Ali's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ali?
Yes, Bobby. This week with news that Hooters Shibuya is trialling its first floating restaurant. Later in the show, I will give my reasons for cautiously recommending the cruise, pending confirmation that the references in their press release to world-class flotation devices were there in the name of safety and not misogyny.
And beat that annually increasing summer heat with a riverboat that has its very own onboard time machine. We'll tell you how much it costs for a family of four to buy a ticket to start over in the 1960s. More on that later, but first, Soap Talk. Let's start off this week by saying a special thank you to Brian.
Oh, snap.
No, not that Brian. This is a special Brian. This is Tom Bryan, who lives in Edinburgh. Regular listeners of the show will know that I'm currently at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and I had an absolutely terrible start to my festival. I turned up to an Airbnb, which I'd booked off-platform, because I'm smart, and it turns out that I booked the house of an aggressive, abusive drunk. And so I checked in at about 11 o'clock at night, and I went straight to bed, didn't even meet the guy because it was my friend that got the key. And I woke up to sounds of, there's no easy way of saying this, domestic violence. And so I knocked on my friend's door to say, we better go downstairs and intervene. This sounds bad. And while that happened, some of the ceiling of the Airbnb fell on the floor. And so I had to compose a message to the host saying, sorry to interrupt, but some of your ceiling's on the floor, which is a sentence that sounds like I've made it up in some like JLPT practice, right? The ceiling is on the floor. It doesn't sound like it's a sentence that should exist in any language. And then in response to my very polite suggestion that some of the ceiling shouldn't be on the floor, this guy stormed into my room while I was actually sat in my underwear eating a soiled sandwich, which is a story that I don't have time for, but just give some context. Absolutely pathetic. And he's a big Polish bloke. He screams, "Get out of my house! You've got to get out of my house right now!"
You could have been eating a clean sandwich in soiled underwear.
That's also true. Well, I did shit myself because he was like getting properly aggressive. And he was like, "You've got to leave my house right now. We have a contract, and that means that the contract's over." And it wasn't the appropriate time for me to mention my multiple law degrees and explaining that's not how contracts work. But he was saying it in such a way as if he was expecting me to plead with him to stay, as if I was going, "Oh no, please let me stay in the abusive house." So anyway, I left, but I didn't leave quickly enough. He packed my things for me, including pictures of my show poster, which was really funny to watch. Like big, angry, aggressive Polish bloke, drunk. Oh, he was drunk because I had 3 beers in the fridge. He drank them by the morning on steroids, carefully packing pictures of my sexy legs into my suitcase on my behalf. I didn't pack quickly enough, so he set his dog on me. So then the dog took a big chunk out of my leg, which was a shame.
Jesus.
Then I went to the. It was a rubbish story. Then I left his house, went to the nearest police station so I could get cleaned up, and the police went around to his house. He made a counterclaim claiming that actually I'd punched him and the bite mark would have already have been there. Which, firstly, I didn't. I've never punched anyone in my life. Secondly, how glad I was to have 5,000 pieces of evidence in my show flyer that I actually had very sexy, blemish-free legs just weeks before the festival. Anyway, all sorts of things I should have done differently. Firstly, I should have done more due diligence because when I booked this guy off platform, he insisted we contract off platform. And I said, fine, but can you just prove that you live where you live so I'm not getting scammed? And he sent me a letter with his name and address on it. But what I didn't check at the time was that letter was sent from some criminal defense solicitors, which wasn't the red flag it should have been at the time. Anyway, I told this story at the start of my first show. And it just so happened that Brian was in the audience. And this Brian said, "Hey, is that story true? I listened to your podcast. It sounds plausible that you'd get yourself in this kind of mess." And I said,
it is
yes.
Very on brand for you.
Absolutely is. And so we need to say a very big thank you to Tom Bryan, who is not only allowing me to stay in his lovely Edinburgh apartment, but also allowing us to record here as well. So in a way, this is our first ever live podcast recording in front of a Brian. He's in the kitchen next door.
Okay, tell him to keep it down. No, I was gonna say this is kind of like a good news, bad news situation, because I mean, good news is it's probably a good thing that you had 20 minutes of space to fill in your hour-long show. Bad news is you used up 20 minutes of our show. Hi, Mark. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Hello there.
Mark, I'm sorry. I had to get this off my chest. There's no way I could have started without explaining that.
No, it had to be done.
I'm an actual pain from this bite. Actually, that's a good point. Does Airbnb do a good job for accessibility?
Now here we get into a story.
Great.
Yes. Airbnb, generally speaking, depending on where you are, does a good job. But, inside of Japan, if we're talking about access to short-term stays in general, currently 0.4% of hotel rooms around the country are wheelchair accessible. So you're going to have a hard time finding anywhere. And if you do look for Airbnb, you may be able to find one that's accessible. But given that the options are so thin and far between for anywhere in this country, you may just find yourself, in a domestic violence situation or getting chased by a dog. But then again, that could be par for the course for a lot of access around here. So, that's a different conversation, I suppose.
Sure. Did you say 0.4%?
Yeah.
That sounds impossibly low. It's like they're trying to make it non-accessible.
Yeah, so as it turns out, according to a 2017 survey by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Tourism, roughly 350-something out of 250,000 surveyed hotel rooms were wheelchair accessible. That number has gotten a little bit closer to 1% as we've gotten closer to the Paralympics, but we're still not at 1% yet.
So, Mark, as a disability activist, one of the things you're clearly very good at is having your numbers down. Besides that, what other things does a disability activist do?
My day-to-day is basically waking up and finding problems or solutions with every single thing I do. So, if I wake up in the morning and I sit up in bed with help from a caregiver, because someone's able to come and help me do that, great. You know what? That's a history project. That's, an accessibility win. Why is this system working? How are they able to get to my house? How do I make sure this happens for other people who need caregivers? If that caregiver doesn't show up, well, guess what? That's a policy paper. I'm going to go yell at a politician and say, hey, look, make a better system. Make sure someone's there to help me get up in the morning. When I take my, get out of my bed and go into my wheelchair, if that wheelchair is there, hey, thank you, engineer who built it. I'm glad that it fits my body. Let's make sure more people can get those. If my chair is not there, again, that's another person to yell at. So whether I'm going from my bed to my wheelchair to the train to my school to my work, whatever it might be, everything I do turns into, hey, look, how do we make the system work as well for other people? Or if it's not working, what do we do to fix it?
And how do you raise awareness, or who do you bring these issues to?
So, I interact with a bunch of different people who make the system work. So if getting up in the morning as a caregiver and getting into my wheelchair as an engineer and riding a train as a station attendant and getting into school as an academic administrator and going to my work is interacting with policymakers, whoever it might be, I'm interacting with folks at every step of the way from all different specializations because they're all involved in making my day-to-day work and everyone else's day-to-day work. At the end of the day, everyone, regardless as to whether they have a disability or not, has to wake up, go to school, go to work, go out and play. So figuring out how to connect all these different stakeholders and make sure that they are able to coordinate their efforts to help as many people as possible. That's my job as a disability advocate.
And I know you do a lot of work for hidden disabilities as well. I know you as a wheelchair user, the fact that you're not able to do certain things physically is quite obvious. And I wonder whether there are some special challenges in Japan about making the country more accessible for people whose problems are less in your face and apparent on first glance.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ali. There's a lot of issues around this, and part of the problem is just that accessibility conversations are relatively new, and there's been a lot of them over the last couple of years. But if we're just starting to have conversations around how to get disabled folks in the room who might have visible disabilities, that creates that much more problem for people who have invisible disabilities. How do they begin to advocate? Can they get in the room and talk about their needs? Who are they talking about their needs to? Is there information out there about who they have to interact with? And how do they get out of issues of stigma? And this is the real thing is, do you really want to go and potentially out yourself as having an invisible disability if it means, repercussions? So we're at this moment in time where we're starting to see accessibility become a greater part of the conversation. The Paralympics are driving part of that. Recent policy developments are as well. But as that access is growing, and we're now just getting to the point where people with invisible disabilities can start to come forward, that's just, a burgeoning conversation that we're going to have to keep following.
Well, we're definitely going to talk about what the Paralympics has done to spark conversation. And we'll look at that in the news. Before we do so, Bobby, we have some people to thank. Is that right?
We have a person to thank.
Okay, that's still something to celebrate.
Thank you to Vincent, who bought us 5 coffees. Vincent writes, due to Ollie's absence in the last episode, I laughed a lot less, but probably learned a lot more. Well, Vincent, I appreciate that, and I hope that this week you were able to laugh twice as hard when picturing Ollie in his underwear getting bitten by a dog.
And on that note, shall we jump into the news?
So, the Olympics are over, and some people in Japan have not forgotten that the Paralympics are also fast approaching. The Paralympics are meant to not only be accessible for the athletes, of course, but also to be an opportunity for everyone to reflect on and improve on accessibility and inclusion in countries all over the world. So I'd like to start by asking, Mark, in your experience, what should Japan be using this opportunity to reflect on and improve on?
Other than obviously the coronavirus response. That's a given. That's a disaster.
Yes. Well, particularly so for people with disabilities, and this kind of gets into... let me connect these points. Why not?
Oh, good. Now I've made a smart point. Thank you very much. So glad to be back.
Hey, look, Ollie, there's a first time for everything. But let me just say this. So when it comes to what COVID has showed us that there are still a lot of barriers in the built environment. Disabled folks have trouble, getting on trains. They've got to wait half an hour for someone to pull out a ramp for a wheelchair user to get on. They can't navigate stores as fast. So when masks are selling out, they're screwed. As disabled people get left behind because the environment's not accessible, they have to rely on their friends and families and caregivers to go out and navigate that environment for them, to get the food, to get the water, to get whatever they might need. But during the coronavirus, because of fears of infection, those networks of friends and family have been falling apart. Folks can't rely on anyone anymore. And that means that they're put in, basically left with no choice but to enter group homes or institutions where a couple people can care for a lot of disabled folks. In theory, this maximizes the cost benefit, but in reality, you can't social distance in a group home. You can't get access to medical supplies effectively. You can't get, personal protective equipment. And you see cluster infections happening at disabled institutions throughout the country. Why does this matter ahead of the Olympics? Well, this same dynamic of, the environment's not accessible. Let's rely on caregivers. Caregivers are not around. Let's institutionalize disabled folks. Institutions lack resources. I guess that's, going to lead to neglect and abuse of the people who live there. That dynamic has been at play for years, long before COVID. And that's what the Olympics and the Paralympics give us a chance to focus on and fix. It's let's rebuild the environment so we're not having to rely so heavily on these care networks that are so precarious. with a country that has the world's fastest aging population, roughly 30% over the age of 65, with a country that has, a shrinking labor force. Currently, Japan is around 340,000 caregivers short. To put that number in perspective, the supply versus demand ratio is roughly, 1 to 15. It's just a huge issue. The Olympics are this chance to reflect on this problem and say, hey, look, let's rebuild the environment. Let's remake these care systems. Let's make sure disabled people can live independent and self-determined lives. That's what the games are for, not just showcasing, a couple of elite athletes with some nice equipment running around a basketball field.
So what you're saying is that even if the Olympics hadn't happened, there is a bit of a ticking time bomb. And while it might be beneficial to make the odd, changes such as the odd ramp here and there so spectators can enjoy the Paralympics, actually, irrespective of the current disabled population, Japan's going to need this structure at some point anyway. So all this has really done is focus the mind a bit sooner.
Exactly. The games have been a springboard for us to really start thinking about these issues and to recognize that building that ramp, whether it's to the Olympic Stadium or to the train station to get you there, is not just a matter of, fixing things for the games, but it's a long-term investment, and it's one that hopefully will pay off down the road.
Saying these are a springboard makes the idea of that ramp sound even more fun.
Oh, yeah. My wheelchair's ready.
Ollie and I are always noticeably uncomfortable anytime we have to talk about anything sports related, even the Olympics. So it was very reassuring to hear you use the word basketball field.
Yes, well, what can I say? As I am very much interested in sports ball as it is.
So you're speaking as somebody who the government actually came to as a consultant for accessibility issues approaching the Paralympics. Compared to other countries in your experience, how does Japan's attitude towards accessibility stack up?
So I think Japan has the right idea, or it's starting to get there. For many years, accessibility in Japan was optional. It was something that you could do, that if you wanted to set up facilities for, disabled folks or old folks or other people who need access, there was some information out there throughout the 80s and 90s, for instance. But since 2000, accessibility became a legal requirement on public transit. And from that moment in time, it's really been you give a mouse a cookie, he wants a glass of milk, or you give a disabled person a train and he gets to go places. So when you get someone on a train, then their school where they can get to finally has to be accessible. When the school becomes accessible, well, then they get education, so you've got to let them get a job. The workplace changes. When they get money from that, then the entertainment venue changes. For the last 20 years, Japan's been building up this awareness in more sectors of society. And with that in mind, it's been similar to places like, the US, the UK, other parts of the world. But what I'll say separates Japan is the target of the accessibility is really different. So, when I come to Japan as, a big fat white guy who uses a big heavy foreign wheelchair, I can't use any of the toilets that are built here. They're all too low to the ground and my chair is too tall. My Japanese friends, when they go to the US and the UK, their chairs are too short and they can't use the toilets over there. So it's really just a matter of who the target is for. And since Japan has its own unique history in the sense that, it lost the war, it had an economic miracle in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and Japan has its own kind of set of political and historical circumstances, the target here is different. You find, tactile pavement that guides blind and visually impaired people everywhere here because Japan's first disability welfare law, which was passed in 1949, had only 5 disabled people on the committee, all of whom were blind. So they get the benefits.
Yeah.
Those were actually a Japanese invention, by the way. Did you know that?
Yeah.
They're called Tenji Broku.
Yeah, the Tenji blocks are great. There's a lot of accessibility options for people on buses. There's the sounds at traffic lights. There's a lot of things that Japan does well, I think.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's a matter of looking at the history, seeing who's been involved in the policy making and why, the benefits tend to reflect them in Japan. The people
Right.
who are involved, the type of impairments they have or disabilities they have are different here than what you see in the US or the UK or South Africa, wherever it might be.
Often there are these monumental moments in countries where you have the first cabinet minister who's a wheelchair user, or you have people who are blind. I know in the UK we had a blind politician who was reading his speeches from Braille, and I think those kind of things do help people like me who don't have those kind of disabilities go, oh wait, that's his workplace, and now I'm actually watching. I can watch how he's interfacing with his job. Does Japan have high-profile people that are publicly demonstrating how their workplace has adapted their work environment for them?
Yeah, so if you want to talk about disabled celebrities in Japan, the first blind diet member was elected in 1905. There was a wheelchair user in 1977. More recently, there have been 2 severely disabled diet members, one with ALS and one with cerebral palsy, who were elected, I want to say, in 2019. So
Okuma Shigenobu, who was prime minister twice, had a fake leg because he got it blown off in a grenade attack.
Mm-hmm. There have been many high-profile people, and if you look at when they show up at these moments in time when history creates a sort of opening for internal and external pressure to collide. For instance, the 2 diet members who were recently elected head of the Paralympic Games, they were elected in part because the Games were coming, in part because of this decades of disability activism that I mentioned a few moments ago. So you get to this point where representation is tied to this sort of key historical moments. Some folks get to say, hey, look, this place is accessible for me, or hey, look, this workplace is not, and this is what has to change. The high-profile ones, just like the Paralympic athletes, the sort of elites who get access to the right type of equipment and the right type of training and the right type of resources, get to showcase that things are improving for them or can improve further for them, but there are also that many people left behind who don't get to do that. So thinking about both sides is important.
Yeah, let's talk about the way the Paralympics raises visibility for a very certain kind of disability. And I apologize if this is a rude way to phrase this, but I think one of the downsides is that it overemphasizes the focus and the visibility on disabled people who are really good at doing stuff.
Right.
I remember there was a memeified thing a while back that it was a Paralympic weightlifter that had the blade type legs, and he was squatting and deadlifting these huge amounts of weight, and down on the bottom it said, "What's your excuse?" And somebody had retweeted that with, "I don't have metal legs." But you had a great example in your TED Talk too. I think it was a ping pong Paralympian.
Badminton, I think, yeah.
Yeah, this had some slogan across it that when you translated it from Japanese, it said, disability is not an excuse, losing is just weakness, or something like that.
Yeah, 障害は弱くに過ぐらい負けたら自分が弱いだけ. Having a disability is no excuse. If you lose, you're just weak. Exactly. Yeah.
Good God.
Yeah.
That's horrible messaging. It just seems like if you'd thought about it, you would have realized that was horrible messaging.
And that was produced by Tokyoto, by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government.
Sorry, just so I can understand what this conversation has now become. Is there a suggestion that the Paralympics can do harm for disabled people? Because when they're asked, excuse me, can you help me get into this train carriage? The response will be, well, no, I've just seen one of yours throw a shot put really far. You can do it yourself. Is that the implication of this question?
If you want to be flippant about it, yes. If you want to be more subtle and vicious about it, it gets far more insidious than that.
I do feel like I've accidentally stumbled on something quite sinister.
Yeah, I mean, look, for as many people as the games help, they can cause problems. Let's be real about it.
Really?
I mean,
I just not considered this.
Yeah, think about it. If you have a pressure to do something, and in this case, in a short amount of time, Japan wins the bid in 2012. They've got the Olympics happening in 2020, or were supposed to happen in 2020 anyway. That gives you 8 years to basically rebuild society from nothing to, full throttle in terms of making accessibility, in terms of accommodating as many people as possible. And when you're rushing to do that, you're not necessarily taking the time to check with everyone to see that what you're doing is useful or desired. I mean, if we think about that poster of someone saying, having a disability is no excuse. If you lose, you're just weak. That obviously is a miss for a lot of folks. There are people who think, well, I don't have the right technology that you do. I don't have the right privilege that you do. I don't have the right body that you do. But anyone would have noticed that if there was time to slow down and think for a minute, maybe putting this out is going to piss off some people. But when you're rushing for the games, you don't always have that time.
I see parallels with the Sheryl Sandberg Lean In backlash, too. This idea that you go, women can do anything and everything and should be doing anything and everything, and that has negative effects on women who are overloaded, women who go, I don't want to have to do everything perfectly and be great at all the different avenues of my life at the same time.
Exactly. Is it why should disabled people have to be superpowered? We shouldn't have to be able to do everything all the time and live up to this image of being either inspirational. Yay! Look at me. I'm inspiring so many people by being here. That's not my goal in life. My goal in life is to wake up, have food, go to bed, and not think about everything else.
If there had been somebody in the room at that advertising meeting, you would have had a real quick response to go, this is not good messaging. This is messaging that doesn't apply to the majority even of disabled people who are not athletes or Paralympic athletes. So there could have been a lot more done to actually listen to people.
Well, Bobby, you're absolutely right, because the Olympics also for non-disabled people, like, we shouldn't feel shame that we're not running 100 meters in 9 seconds. Should we?
No. I did some
Thank
math
you.
and no.
But that's the parallel, isn't it? Right? Like, it's a subsection of non-able-bodied people who are good at sport, and that's all it needs to be, because that's all it is for able-bodied people too.
But they did make some effort to reach out and get advice on how to proceed. In particular, I know you were consulted, Mark. So when the government comes to you and says, what do we need to do ahead of the Paralympics, what do you say?
So the first thing I tell them is, well, if you want to figure out where we have to go, you can't ask one person. I'm a white 30-year-old foreigner in a wheelchair who lives in the middle of Odaiba and goes out very, very sparingly. My perspective is not the same as every other disabled person who lives in Japan or outside of Japan. So you need to get more people involved in the conversation. You need to figure out how to get more people at the table. And to have that happen, you can recommend a number of things. You can say, let's crowdsource information. Let's, start using our phones to get information about what works and what doesn't work for people. But at the end of the day, even those conversations have a limit. You can only get information from so many people, either because only so many folks submit information, or so many folks can be reached and know about the crowdsourcing initiative you're doing. At the end of the day, you can only gather so much, and you have to make choices. So when you tell the government, hey, let's collect information from as many people as possible, they're still going to turn around and say, okay, but what is the right choice? Tell us. And for me, there's a limit there, but I have to give a recommendation, and sometimes I'm listened to and sometimes I'm not.
Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 95 of Japan by River Cruise. Don't forget, we have a new episode every Friday. We look forward to seeing you then.
And thank you to our guest this week, Mark Bookman. Mark, thanks for joining us. It was extremely educational. Anything you'd like to share with our listeners before we go?
Yeah, so thank you so much again for having me. I'll say one thing here. At the end of the day, all of us listening are involved in the process of making accessibility. When we wake up, when we go to school, when we go to work, we're always, changing the environments around us or building them in some ways that help us get around. And I think it's important that we all think about how we can use our efforts and the fact that we're walking around these different places to make the environment more accessible for other people too. So I'd encourage you all to ask your friends, ask your family, ask the people around you what you can do to make the environment more accessible for them. And hopefully, as we all get access to more spaces, we'll have a more inclusive and a more interested world.
Most people plug a book or an article or a YouTube video, and Mark plugs compassion, making us all look bad. Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we will see you guys next week.